Okay, well, hello and welcome to Making Values Visible panel. I'm Michael Lawrence. I'm the legal advisor to With Friends. I've also worked with Joe and Kunal on other ventures like Silent Barn. Been honored to work with the team at With Friends for the last year. As you've heard from the founders, we've been able to raise about $250,000 for art spaces all over the world, and that's helped them to be more sustainable in their programming. So that's really been something that I've been proud to work on with the team. Going back to Silent Barn, that was a space that started in Queens in 2006, moved to Bushwick in 2012, and ran until April of this year. The team at With Friends has tried to take some of the lessons of that experience to build a platform that has been able to keep these spaces open and thrive in the long run. The panel that we have today is assembled to talk about their experiences fundraising and also talk about generally what the economic value of culture is. Right now I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and also talk about the value of their work.
Hi everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for having me and happy birthday to With Friends. It's so awesome. And I know the struggles of doing something from the beginning, obviously. My name is Frankie. I'm one of the co-founders of Disc Women. I'm not sure how familiar people are with it, but we are a music, primarily an artist agency founded out of Bushwick, specifically Bossa Nova Civic Club. We started about 4 years ago. And we're still here somehow. I don't know how, but we are, and it definitely comes down to a lot of creativity, honestly, which is kind of what we were discussing outside briefly, that the way to kind of to survive as these I don't know how to describe what I do, but weird anomaly projects that bring people together. I guess that works. You kind of have to find ways to survive, and one of the values that keeps us kind of going is this just need and want to provide spaces for people who are marginalized. That's really all it is, and not all it is, you know what I mean, that's a big thing, but you get what I'm saying. But that's really the heart of kind of what we do. Yeah.
Hi, and happy birthday. So my name is Anango Lumumba-Kasongo, and I'm a producer and rapper who goes by the name Samus. And I'm Philadelphia-based, but I find myself in New York City about half of the month, or at least for shows and other things like that. And I'm also kind of have more recently developed a project with my fiance called the Zero Suits Project, in which we attempt to provide resources and stories through podcasts and written posts and little video posts about being independent and full-time artists. So I'm a full-time rapper producer, as I said, and he's a full-time writer. And so it's our hope that through sharing those experiences, folks will not necessarily feel like, oh, I have all the tools to become full-time at this, but even if they're thinking about writing a story or what do those first steps look like. And as far as the values, I would say one of my primary values as a musician and in terms of putting this project together is accessibility, which is not to be confused with relatability, which I think often it's like its cousin. So it's not that I'm making music or trying to produce content that everybody completely, that speaks to every person, but that can at least allow or empower folks to speak to their specific communities in similar ways. So yeah.
Hi, and also thank you, and happy birthday With Friends, and also kind of wanted to say shout out and thank you to everyone in the room. I think I've lived with some of you. I've seen some of you on the streets in movements and protest contexts, and also I know a lot of you are involved in a lot of different initiative and projects that have spanned from the 25 years of this space to kind of less than that, but still for a very long time. My name is Victoria Sobel, and I think I kind of have presently found myself in the fields of art and education, though I think I find myself on this panel as an invitation from Joe to talk a little bit about my experiences with institutions and fundraising from a non-fundraiser or financial perspective. how that interacts with time and consequences, and a lot of the different things that you both brought up in terms of like appropriation, living in cities, how intergenerationality can affect the spaces, and how DIY might stack up with a more traditional or citywide or legal-based perspective. Most of my experience comes from kind of a little bit of renegade finance at Occupy Wall Street, and then if any of you are familiar with the Cooper Union, a school that I went to that I now teach at, which was founded to be free and accessible to all admitted students, and in its time in the 1850s was actually quite revolutionary in trying to offer education to immigrant and women and people of color, but has kind of found itself financially in a set of conditions that would require it to start charging tuition. And so myself, my students, and a lot of others have been dealing with what the consequences of that means, and what the possible ramifications for how that plays out in an educational or a creative industry type of environment over the last 7 or 8 years. So I hope that that can tangentially be interesting in the conversation.
Okay, so the first question I'm going to put out to the panel is how generally you fund your work, being in the art world and cultural spaces. I guess Frankie.
Well, for us, we're not a non-profit. We fund ourselves primarily through merchandise. You know, shirts. You know what merchandise is. But we also, I mean, our main sort of element when we went into it, well, it kind of developed after a while, was that we kind of wanted to be like stakeholders in the industry we were working in. So our main like goal was to kind of emulate a business model that was similar to our like competitors. So we started an agency, and that's kind of been our main framework of generating revenue, as well as merchandise, which, as you can imagine, doesn't generate a lot, but the merchandise definitely kept us afloat. We've also accepted sponsorship from certain companies, which, you know, people definitely have criticisms of, and which are understandable, but also, you know, I defend our decisions to work with certain companies which have really helped us prosper and bring out artists into other fields and all this kind of stuff. So having certain financial cushions here and there definitely helped us, and then we've been able to maintain that through merchandising and our agency. That's the full transparency of our business operations.
And so as an artist, I would say most of my money through touring and merchandise as well. But also, so I'm a PhD student at Cornell University, unfortunately. Do not get your PhD. Just like letting you all know that. Don't do it. But anyway, so through that, I have been able to kind of build relationships in kind of other academic institutions. So occasionally I'll go and give talks or speak on my research. And that also affords me a kind of source of income, or unexpected source of income. And in terms of the Zero Suits project, we started on Patreon and still have a Patreon page. So for those who don't know, this is kind of a crowdfunding platform as well. But I think it's more kind of traditionally geared towards, like, I see like a lot of visual artists and like YouTubers and other folks like that who use that platform. But then in December, Patreon kind of underwent some changes that really messed with the community and with folks who were giving and creators, and that was when I first encountered with friends. People were tweeting about alternatives to Patreon, and so then I kind of set up a page through that and have to do a better job of sharing that page, but that's kind of another source of income.
I think my 2 anecdotes related to fundraising maybe we'll come back to because they might be too long from now, but as an artist, I focused on teaching this one class, so as like an adjunct, you can imagine that doesn't bring in the ends meet, but I also have had over the years opportunities to visit other institutions and kind of through stipended work cobbled together, and I think probably like many people in the room, the rest comes from gigs, working gigs, under the table work, temporary work, things that a lot of people have had to take on just to make kind of, again, what we're talking about, the DIY process possible, because it doesn't really always fall on the same 9 to 5 as everything else. But I do think probably anecdotally what my fundraising experience has to do with was setting up some sort of system for Occupy Wall Street, which started down here in 2011 in Lower Manhattan, but really took on financially a national framework, at least temporarily, and then later a large fundraising effort, crowdsourcing to bring a lawsuit again with the Cooper community against the then Board of Trustees and Administration of the school. And for scale, that effort over 2 crowdsourcing waves also brought in over $250,000. So I think it's worth talking about when we talk about all of the work and efforts and like obviously hundreds of people that it's taken to raise the type of money that With Friends has brought in, and also these kinds of moments in which like under extreme duress, lots of money can be found towards like offsetting really negative or positive causes, but what the kind of like repercussions and possible fallout that come from that are.
Okay. So from all of you, I've heard the notion of values being a motivating force, but also I've heard a couple of instances where values can sort of set like boundaries as far as what you're willing to do to raise additional funds. Victoria, I'd like to hear from you first about, you talked a little bit about Occupy Wall Street, and obviously there is a lot of value behind that movement. If you could talk a little bit about the motivating values that you had that created additional economic value, and sort of the constraints in terms of what you weren't willing to do.
Sure, I think constraints are probably the best angle to take it from, and I think I'll try and keep it brief, because maybe if anyone, a lot of you were actually there, so that's another benefit of this, is that actually we can talk about it from shared experience. But I think I came to Occupy Wall Street as a 21-year-old. I was essentially at that moment a dropout, and I was really surprised that there weren't a lot of people my age, for the most part, around, and I quickly realized it was because most of my cohort was in school and like myself had taken out a lot of debt to go to school, but couldn't afford actually to be there in person. And so that was one of the first realizations I had in kind of working with just a few people on the ground, to 100 people, 150, 200 people, from really an intergenerational group of long-term and newer activist people coming from out of state. And really it was started with like just getting food and feeding people and seeing who's on the ground, and dumpster diving to this the kind of scale that maybe you all might remember towards the end of when the parks and different occupations were evicted. There was a lot of growth that happened then. Mainly I was involved in media groups that were kind of coming from an indie media collective-based, many people organizing source, and it became really apparent early on that money, resources, material accumulation were going to be things that people who were physically there or who wanted to be physically there were going to have to contend with. And I will say that actually maybe the short funny version is that someone had set up, in 2011 crowdsourcing was pretty different, but someone had set up a small kind of GoFundMe page for the kitchen. And again, the kitchen was to feed people who were spending all their time there, and it was really just peanut butter sandwiches. But really quickly, people who couldn't find themselves at the park started flooding that page with donations in a way that I think kind of viral crowdsourcing most people are familiar with now can really just get out of hand and grow and grow and grow. And so actually the motivation initially was to kind of put a cap on that and not have this one guy be totally liable for now all of a sudden like tens of thousands of dollars from a point of like, again, dumpster diving, no food, no money. Everyone's pulling out their wallets to buy some rope to set up tarps. So this really quick and maybe unintended or unaccounted for type of growth or injection of resources, or really capital in this case, in a situation where, ironically being there to kind of have this anti-capitalist dialogue about what's going on with the market and the economy. And so basically my role at that time was interfacing with a bunch of lawyers to see what, if any, option there might be to, one, kind of get this guy off the hook for what was happening on that page, besides shutting it down, or in addition to shutting it down, and two, kind of reaching out to federal credit unions and fiscal sponsors and kind of seeing if there was some sort of framework in which people might start to, I mean, again, the kind of funny, like, send in used textbooks for people who wanted to learn in the park. Many of you might remember, like, the library from the park, from Zuccotti Park, which grew to be quite large. And so things like that kind of played with scale and time and desire, but they also had a lot of unintended interactions in terms of scalability or in terms of replicability in other encampments that I think for the most part of my experience, I spent the rest of the next year to 18 months kind of untangling with people in other cities, figuring out what happened, what went wrong, or kind of what there was to do when all of the kind of physical encampment was done. So, and that was a lot for 21, but yeah, I don't know if that starts at.
Yeah. Inangu, you mentioned the different platforms that you've worked with. You were on Patreon for a while, and now you're using with friends. Could you talk about, expand a little bit on the different values that you felt you didn't want to go one way and you decided to go the other?
Yes, bless you. I think, let me think about that. So it's interesting being in this space talking with folks because a lot of the conversation is geared around like community spaces or community resources, and artists are kind of weirdly in that because they build communities, or they might have communities around them, but those folks might not see themselves as a community. Their relationship is to this like one thing or this one artifact or one person. And so in trying to figure out how to like raise funds for my work as an artist, it's been trying to figure out how many audiences to try to reach out to or try to be in conversation with. And that's been really, really challenging because a lot of the communities that I value the most are not the communities that have the most to give. And so there's this constant, I think, anxiety about like, how even to set like price points. So for Patreon, for example, that you can contribute $1 and that will give you access to almost everything, and then trying to scaffold that. But then I also get weirdly co-opted into certain like tech spaces where folks do have a lot of money to give. And so then, trying to build in something that can support folks who can give more is something that I feel conflicted about. I mean, when I first started making music, I remember I released it on Bandcamp, and then 2 days later, I released it for free on SoundCloud because I just felt awful charging people for my music, and had to slowly learn that what I was doing was valuable in taking my time and my energy, and that people were finding value from it and able to kind of move throughout their day by listening to some of the music. But that was a really, really challenging thing for me. And in terms of trying to veer over towards With Friends, I like the kind of community focus of With Friends. I like the idea that this is about, again, that it's sort of values focused, whereas Patreon, I think, is kind of like functionality. Like, here is a really easy way to do these things, to like share your comics or share your videos or whatever it is that you're working on. But as far as like building a community around a set of values, that strikes me as being kind of ancillary to the main focus. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Frankie, you talked a little bit before about some aspects of Disc Woman that people may have issue with. The first of which was the sponsorships. So what is there a framework that Disc Woman has figured out? Like, we can do these sponsorships, or we don't want to do these sponsorships?
I know this sounds like really hippie, but it's like kind of just a vibe. A lot of our business is based off of vibes. Wow, that sounds so stupid. But but it is really just like case by case. Like I think one of the first sponsors we worked with was Smirnoff, and that was years ago. But to be honest, we haven't really worked with that many. But that was one that helped us sort of elevate into our next stage. And, you know, especially when you're sort of earlier doing it, your critical eye on sponsorship maybe isn't as like particular because you're just excited about someone wanting to invest in what you're doing. But even in reflection, like our experience was really nice, and you know, we made it very clear that we wanted these things and that and that and that. And I'm actually really proud of the way that we've kind of used that cushion to elevate what we're doing and include more people and essentially like get the artists we're representing paid. We've been able to turn it into something else, which I know sometimes can have like, I don't know, what's the word? I think people maybe try and say you can turn money and, you know, but money from a shitty place into something great is like annoying thing that people say. But in this circumstance, I actually do believe that like that's what happened, and I felt like the people doing it were really good. Yeah, you know, I understand. I think we did something. What was it? I think it was with maybe SoundCloud, perhaps. Anyway, it was something, and someone commented on a photograph because, you know, when you do these sponsored things, you have to do a post or something as part of it or some shit. And someone commented being like, "These corporations are ruining the world. You should fund yourself this way." And I was like, okay, well, here's our PayPal. Literally, give me the money and we'll do it. Like, I think people expect you to like have relentless labor without any getting paid for it, essentially. And that's something, like you were saying, that you have to kind of like learn to know, is that your time is money. And once you realize your value in that way, I think it's important to make sure that you are paid for it, because it gets really exhausting and hard to function, and you can't function, and in that way you're really useless to like what you're doing if you're not unable to sustain yourself. So while sponsorship is something that definitely like a big way in which we started, there hasn't been really that many things that we've done, and we've said a no a lot, actually, to be honest, and some things just don't fit, and it's not worth it to sacrifice what you're doing and, you know, your values just to get a check. For us, that's not really how we operate. We only operate with stuff that we think works with what we're doing and is going to be there for like what we're doing, essentially. But merchandise, again, honestly, like really keeps us like afloat and surviving.
Well, thank you. So as far as cultural values, so as I was saying before, I was involved with Silent Barn, which is a venue that was not that profitable from a business standpoint. But there were times that we needed an influx of cash, and we went to the community, and we were able to raise $30,000 in a month. So that, when I thought about that, I was thinking about what cultural values are the easiest to create economic value from. So I was thinking about that when putting together this panel, and I would like to throw that out to our panelists, maybe Victoria, if you have some thoughts on that question and like to expand.
I think it's actually a really good prompt in a way. Like, I was thinking just while you all were talking about kind of the interplay of time and this idea of fundraising for or fundraising against things, and also kind of how in that way cultural values tend to either emerge or be codified or become accepted as a norm, or how things like outrage or, you know, again, maybe more in movement or political spaces can become palatable or taken as a baseline, how, and like kind of that play between ceilings and floors, and situations in which, whether they be spaces or initiatives or any of the different types of things that many of us have been involved with, have either become normalized or invisibilized by other types of intervening societal structures, right? Like, and the fact that the types of values that we might be having conversations about for me, in a classroom or in studio visits aren't necessarily represented or captured by larger, more mainstream or more official, more technical spaces or ways of kind of existing. And probably, I'm sure everyone always feels like this throughout time, but I'm sure that if everyone thinks on the last 10 years, kind of from the last recession until this point, we can all appreciate how expansive and compressed the different types of terminology or language as they relate to values has kind of shifted. And how, again, how different types of institutions, be it legal or otherwise, might be kind of having a type of, I don't really know, I don't think it's a top-down or a dripping kind of thing, but I just think that it kind of bleeds into the type of spaces that might be pre-existing or might not be observable by kind of these larger mechanistic structures, be it a city or, again, like a department or an institution, and kind of how you know, we're forced to kind of historicize ourselves and also remember spaces and places and movements that have come before that have either had to close or can't exist within those types of frameworks, because it's a type of community history and like storytelling that kind of keeps those places vibrant in what's otherwise becoming kind of a service-based or data-driven type of landscape that we're finding ourselves in. So I think there's something really something there for us all to think about. I know it plays a large role in my practice, is kind of figuring out what the difference is between what can be captured or understood in an archive and what can be, and what we can only, you know, talk about between ourselves or in spaces where it's safe to talk about.
I had a follow-up on the Cooper Union, your involvement with Cooper Union, and obviously you mentioned that it was it offers free education. Do you find that, I don't know how involved you are with sort of the administration of that institution, but do you find that that value of like free education is allows that institution to sort of further that goal?
Right. I mean, I think, and I'll keep it super short. Please find me if you're interested in knowing more about what's going on at Cooper. But I think Cooper actually was historically free, and it was founded to be a place, not this one place that would be free. The founder founded it in a time when a lot of other institutions in the 1850s were just starting up. A lot of civic-minded institutions, and he was amongst a set of philanthropic white guys that were kind of thinking that they were progressive, and he thought maybe he could be an outlier in that, set this bar post, and that in turn his peers would follow. And obviously in the time since then, that's not really what's happened at all in higher education in America, really at all. And it kind of became this one place, this one exception with all of that kind of contingent on it, right? Be that one place, be that place that's free. At least there's that one place that's free. CUNY's not free anymore. These other places aren't free anymore. At least there's this one place. And so, you know, in the time in which we had a financial issue within the school that had, you know, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I think actually what I noticed the most was that the intervening forces in that situation were largely external, that actually a lot of other colleges and other institutions had a stake in whether or not Cooper remained free. In a way, if it didn't, it's more excuse for everyone else to say, like, look at that was a really outdated, that's just not how it works these days. And in fact, that's kind of what came to pass, right? Most people feel like, oh, it did what it could while it could, and financially it wasn't a viable model. And actually an attorney general lawsuit found that in fact it was a viable model, and mismanagement, really critical mismanagement, meant that kind of gets bungled in the story. And so in a way, since we are no longer offering a free education, our students are paying, it's not just about the students at Cooper, it's really the fact that this model has been eradicated from a larger system, and other schools, and whether they're new or old or really old, are able to kind of point and be like, see how risky that was to offer that? Like, this is why we need to have this kind of price point, and let alone whether or not a price point or a price tag for attending a formal college really reflects the cost of educating students. So, yeah.
Thank you. Inangu, you mentioned earlier that there was a point where you were putting music out, or in general, the easiest ways to sort of scale that cultural value were not exactly how you wanted to exploit your work. Could you talk about or expand a little bit more on whether you have found ways to exploit your work in line with the values of having it be accessible to the people that you want it to be accessible for?
Yeah, I think it's been really challenging because I guess going back to the conversation that you all were having about like what values translate most easily. I mean, people want like a thing, like a product, and in many ways what I'm asking for is support to kind of be able to do all of the in-between stuff that happens from project to project, and that is not legible by a lot of folks. You know, you know, even to my own family, to my own parents, it's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? You know, until you have like the thing. And so there's this, I think, constant tension between, even in terms of releasing projects. You know, I'll release an album that took a year and a half to make, and within 2 months someone will ask me, when's your next project coming? And so, you know, people are very hungry for things and to know that their money goes directly to those things. So I would say that I haven't actually found a way that makes sense to, I guess the way that I'm trying to do that is by opening up that process as something that can be monetized, that like the process itself, like the kind of window into what it takes to make a song, or, you know, should I work with a manager or not, or what are the pros and cons of working with a label, like trying to find parts of the experience that folks will connect with and feel like they can support. But I do very much feel like it's, and as you were saying, it's difficult because it's part of a bigger ecosystem. So folks will who I find contribute to my Patreon are folks who have contributed to other Patreon accounts and know that that's a thing and have those values. So instilling that in new groups of people is really challenging, as you all know.
Thank you. And Frankie, obviously you talked about merchandising is one way that you fund your projects. But could you talk a little bit about why you feel like this woman has taken off? Like, what draws people to it? And if you could, like, identify a couple of values that are the strong pull.
I think it's interesting to point out when we first started, like, we would constantly sort of pitch all women lineups to venues, and I remember specifically the venue in Montreal was like, yeah, that's nice, but like it's not going to get people in the door. Like this whole idea that all women in a lineup wasn't profitable enough when we first started. And now it's kind of shifted a lot, and that's kind of what a lot of people want to invest in is diversity. And then it was really a struggle for that to be the case and for us to get funded in that way. And now when people want to come to us and invest in us because of diversity, I'm like, nah, we're good, thank you. So things like have changed a little bit, like in terms of that, because you see sort of brands and platforms wanting to use that kind of identity politics extravaganza for their own gain, essentially, which, you know, to some degree does have some kind of benefits that, you know, bigger platforms are sort of engaging with that. But you do get scared that your values will get lost in those projects. And, you know, we sort of like, we consistently get hit up for International Women's Day events and like things kind of like that are very centered around like that value. And it's often by brands who any other day of the year don't really care about that kind of stuff. So you kind of have to sort of like pick. It's kind of a weird territory to be in, but I'd say from kind of when we've started, you know, me, Emma, and Christine, who all founded it together, you know, one of the things at the heart of what we do, which sounds really corny, and like one of the values that we try and keep within what we do is just like being really kind to each other and to the people that we work with. We like to be respectful, humble, yet transparent and clear. Like that's just the way we kind of operate. And I think, you know, as well as us sort of centering folks who don't usually get a platform, I think, you know, in conjunction with those kind of values of being kind and honest and stuff like that, I think that's often what people are drawn to in terms of like working with us. And I hope that that kind of continues. That's been something that I've really wanted to have a part of what we do. I mean, being in New York for so long and working in really shitty jobs and being mistreated constantly by this city, I think we can all relate to being in those kind of shitty situations. I worked in food service, I did deliveries, like I've done all that like crap. And I know the way people can mistreat people, and that's one of the hearts of our company is like that we want to not mirror those ways of like operating as a business where you have to shit on people below you. And I hope that that's why people want to continue to work with us, and that's something that we want to like keep at the center of what we do, alongside also being a supporting platform for those who generally don't get centered as a voice.
Yeah. Do you actually? That's an interesting point you bring up about just how you deal with the people you work with. Do you think that creates an additional value? I know it's an intangible thing, but do you get comments like, "This is why I work with this woman," or do venues work with you for that reason?
Absolutely. I mean, in the same grade, it's also like you gotta be, you know. In my inbox anyway, I deal with a lot of men who think I don't know what I'm doing. Constantly. So there's definitely a level of an aggressor that I have to be at the same time. But you know when to sort of pick your battles. But I definitely think that, the way you want to be treated in the world starts with you and how you treat people right next to you. Just because the person, you're getting coffee from isn't going to give you your career doesn't mean you shouldn't treat them the way they should be treated. And like that's just like a really huge value for me, and that's the way I like to conduct a lot of how I do personally do business. And I do think that is something that isn't necessarily always talked about in a really forward way, but I do think it's a huge like thing. Like microaggressions can really like ruin people's days. And I even catch myself doing it. Of course, everyone does, but I think like, I think it's just really important, obviously.
All right, so I think we are close to wrapping up. I would just like to share some of the themes that I heard as all of our panelists were talking. First of which was leading with your most identifiable value. Whether that be free education, accessibility, and diversity could be things that sort of set you apart from the rest of the crowd. Know what you're not willing to do, whether that be sponsorships or any type of other business opportunities is also important. And intangible things like how you treat people, business partners, can also create value. So with that, I'd like to thank our knowledgeable and esteemed panel for the thoughts that they offered today. I found it very enlightening. Thank you all. And I think what would be great is if we could have this conversation amongst each other about, what creates value, or assessing the value in these cultural organizations, just one-to-one. So if we could break and just find someone, introduce yourself to someone you may not know, and have this conversation, that would be great. Thank you.